Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. Every other week, outside of the legislative session, we talk about the research our center directors have been following, policies that the state has been enacting, impacts, and analysis of the things that you need to know to be informed about what's happening in your state and to act according to your own conscience. You can't act without being informed, and we're here to make sure that you know the true context and the reality behind the policies that are instituted in the state, as well as alternatives that we think would be better for the state of Washington, better to improve lives throughout the state here. Now, we have these every other week outside of the legislative session. During the legislative session, it's every week. For those of you just joining us for the first time, we take questions in the Q&A box down below. Put your question in, and we'll take it at any point during the interviews. So we do try and answer all the questions. If we miss your question, we'll try and answer it afterward. If it's unrelated to the subject, we might miss it, but I'll try and type something into you as the broadcast goes on. First, we're going to start with Lee Finne, Washington Policy Center's director for the Center for Education, who has a new blog about the disappearing public school students, which actually reminded me of a blog that you posted outside of, I think it was during COVID, where there was a number of students kind of missing from the rolls. And one of the things I saw the superintendent of public instruction remark was that, while some people were highlighting this exodus of students, it was really more of a demographic question. So tell us about this exodus of students, and could it be explained by just declining demographics?
Well, that's a good question. No, the answer is that the numbers are so large that it's not because of fewer numbers of 5-year-olds showing up for school. Okay, we're talking about 46,000 students have failed, have not shown up, have not enrolled for public education like they did in October of 2019 before COVID. Okay, so it's been a drop of enrollment reaching over 4% of total students enrolled in Washington state schools. It's the highest outmigration in the nation, one of the highest numbers of families just so unhappy with what the public schools did during COVID, closing the schools for nearly 2 years to instruction, and a whole list of reasons why families have lost confidence and trust in the system of public schools. And so this trying to blame the fall in 5-year-olds for this is just a lie, because it's not true. Yes, the demographics are showing fewer kids showing up, but not to that great a number, not to 4% of the total. So this is just a misdirection, another example of the schools not taking responsibility for what they did during COVID. And another reason why families have lost trust and faith in the system of public schools. So, I mean, they don't want to be held accountable for the decisions they made during COVID. And so they are trying to change the subject, say there's no problem here, nothing to see here, while the evidence is very different. The evidence shows that the families are leaving in droves, and there's been a 25% increase in the enrollment of in the enrollment in private schools, and from the numbers went from 65,000 students enrolled in private schools in 2019 to now 81,000 students enrolled in private schools, and now, and in addition, the homeschooling numbers have also grown dramatically, from 21,000 students before COVID to 30,000 students now. That means that 25,000 students that were formerly in the public education are now in private education, whether homeschooling or private schools. You can't say that a 1% drop in demographics is the reason for that. Parents have made decisions with the opportunities given to them for educating their children, and taken on costly measures to actually deliver a quality education to their children. So I get very discouraged when I see the state superintendent of public education not telling the truth about what's happening in the schools.
Do you attribute the exodus to parents frustrated from COVID, or do you feel like even post-COVID, there's things that the schools are doing and attitudes that the officialdom in schools have taken regarding COVID that is contributing to the exodus?
Yes, I think that families have seen a drop in standards and expectations for learning. Academic learning standards have dropped. It is easier to get an A, grade inflation. It's easier to graduate. They've greased the skids so that kids don't have to show up to the bar and prove that they've learned what they're supposed to be learning. And this system, in order to avoid looking bad, is lowering standards for grading. They're lowering standards for graduating from high school. They're playing games with the numbers, saying that it's not because parents are unhappy. And there are other things that are happening in the public schools that really shocked a lot of people, that during COVID, there has been this radical introduction of this radical gender theory and radical critical race theory, which is an ideology that's completely invented. It's false. It has no place in a pluralistic society in our public school system, which is supposed to be a non-ideological place. Now it's very much an ideological place, and if you don't toe the line, you are made to pay. So that most public school families do not like the turn that the schools have taken. But the schools don't really care because they have a guaranteed income stream. They're getting more money. Every year they ask for more money, even though they're now educating fewer students. So they really have no true penalty, or there's no accountability measure to keep these people in check, the radicals in check in the public system. So that's why school choice, again, I sound like a broken record, but that is why introducing real accountability by allowing parents to take some of their own education dollars to homeschool or pay private school tuition is taking off in other states. I mean, it really is exciting what's going on in other states in this country in response to these developments in the public schools. And it is not just the closed school shutdown during the 2 years, it's also the values issue that's driving families out of public education. They do not want to subject their children to a racist ideology, which is what's happening here. So you're seeing all kinds of fights, as you know, in school boards across the country over this. But the end result is that caring lawmakers are letting parents out. They're giving them an option to the standardized forced assignment to a public school system. Very exciting development.
One of the things that you point out in the blog is the state constitution points to the state's paramount duty to provide for the education of every individual child. And, then you make the case that that clause in the state constitution means that money should follow the children, whether they're in public or private school anyway. In the past, I think that there's a uniform clause in there, a uniform system. How would you get around that? Because I know that on the progressive left, they point to that and say that's why the school choice isn't allowed, no private scholarship vouchers, no moving outside of this government system is allowed.
Well, that is, so if that were true, then you would not permit people to go to private schools, right? So if the uniformity clause requires every child to go to a government-run public school system, you would not permit children to go to private schools. Or
I meant public funding for it,
well, so that's the point.
Well, you could go, but we're not obligated to pay for anything unless it's part of our uniform system.
Well, the paramount duty clause does not say anything. Let's just start with that. The paramount duty clause itself says that the state is to make ample provision for the education of every child within its borders. All right. And provision doesn't necessarily mean dollars, which is how it's been interpreted by the left. Provision could include options that are not government run so that the children can actually get a quality education. As far as the uniformity clause is concerned, we allow public charter schools in this state, and they are independently run from the government school system. And so that fails on its face. The uniformity clause only means that every child should have access to a public publicly funded education, whether it's publicly delivered or privately delivered, is not a restriction on that clause. So it's just another misdirection about what the law actually says.
Yeah, you'd think that the same argument could be made that says if you provide a certain scholarship for everyone, that's a uniform system. Also,
Exactly.
it's a uniform provision. Everybody has a certain amount that can follow them, and however they choose to use it is just it's up to them, because obviously we don't have uniform children that are all the same. But I mean, I guess if you're an ideology that seeks equality for all instead of equality of opportunity, the only way you make everyone equal is to make everyone equally miserable, because you have to strip talents away from people.
Well, I mean, education is a perfect example of this, because you hear of many children being unhappy in the public school system. It's very coerced. You can only learn from kids. You're put into a kind of a track according to your age. You can't move ahead of the grade if you're so inclined. You can't be educated by children older or younger than you. It is very conformist and standardized, and getting more so every day. Okay, and that actually underserves a great number of children that do not fit into the average model, and no one child does anyway. So the whole structure is a flawed one. And I mean, back in the in the 1700s, when they were discussing government in England, they were discussing this idea of the government providing an education for all. There was a discussion over whether the government should do it or whether the government should just fund it and the private sector deliver it. And unfortunately, and the arguments were fascinating at the time, because the proponents of making education available and to all, funded by the government but delivered by the private sector, were saying, if you allow the government to run the schools, you're going to end up with government indoctrination to keep those people that are running the schools in power. And that is what we're seeing today. 300 years later, 350 years later, we're seeing exactly the forecast at the time of the danger of letting the government run the schools in spades. And I mean, if you start to think about what an education really is, preparing a child to flourish in his life, there's so much that's mandated in the public schools now that is counterproductive to that aim. I mean, children come with an incredible desire to learn and curiosity, and we should be encouraging them to follow their interests, not forcing them to jump through all these hoops. I mean, no wonder we have so many people that are homeless and dropping out of the public schools. And now 46,000 families have pulled their kids out of the public education system in Washington State. Is nobody listening to this? Does nobody care? Has there been a survey done? Have there been any exit interviews, conducted by the Seattle Public Schools for why thousands of children are no longer going there? Could there be something wrong with the discipline policy in the schools, where if you misbehave and you're a certain race, you do not get disciplined? I mean, it's really, I keep hearing horror stories, really, Dave, about the lack of discipline in the classrooms. Well, you need discipline if you're going to have a classroom of 30 kids for children to learn. To give parents an exit, parents have an urgent problem that faces them, and that is getting their children educated. And they can't wait until the adults fight out and come to an agreement over how to run the schools. For 40 years, we've been arguing about how to improve the public schools. It's way past time to give parents direct access to the money. I mean, 8 million students now in 8 different states in the country now have access to universal school choice. That's a big deal. We're seeing a revolution in public education happening in these other states. And the news of this can't help but come to Washington State, even if the mainstream news won't cover it. But now we have states, West Virginia, Florida, Arizona, Utah, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Ohio, and I always forget the 8th one, but that's 8, and there are more states on deck that are going to give families access to public dollars between $4,000 to $8,000 per child to defray the cost of homeschooling or pay private school tuition. Think of what that will do to the private market of schooling. It will increase the enrollment at existing private schools, but it will also lead to the creation of new, exciting private school models. There are all these micro schools that are being developed now, where student learning is the focus, student-directed learning. I was just reading this morning from a book by Carrie McDonald called Unschooling. This is a very sort of free-spirited form of education where children are encouraged to follow their interests, pursue their interests, and not be constricted by all these requirements. So I find it an incredibly exciting time in public education. And ironically, it's coming, on the heels of the COVID school shutdown and the takeover of the schools by the CRT and gender radical activists. I mean, there is a blowback, and it's big time, and it's fascinating to watch.
Well, I think it makes sense that they, in a normal circumstance, if you're a normal business, and you see a sudden decline of sales, you would respond and try to figure out, where am I going wrong with these customers? What's going on here? But there is no direct accountability customer basis. There's a flirtation with it with local school boards and other things, but really it's each individual child is different. The parent is different. The parents and the child are the ones consuming, and it's their needs that need to be met. And by the time, if there is a problem, by the time they get it addressed, frequently they've either moved to a different school because they've moved up one grade or so forth. They just move out, and then it just goes away, or it's never addressed. So with these people opting out, it's even bigger than just selecting something else, because you get punished so severely for it, because you have to pay a private tuition, or one of you is going to have to stay home and devote hours a day to educating the child. That is, when you vote with your actions to take your child out of a public school, it is a huge message, that if 4% are doing it, in the old radio business where I spent 17 years, we got certain comments from people, and the rule of thumb was, if one person is saying this, then X number of people were probably thinking it also. If people are leaving and they're paying thousands of extra dollars to get that same supposed product somewhere else, it's even a bigger, louder message than the establishment would have you think with the numbers.
I think that's very true. Not everyone has the resources to pay private school tuition or homeschool at home. So that means that there are people that are forced to send their children to schools that they do not support. That would, if they had the option, they would leave. And this is not good for the community and for the environment of educating children well, because the parents and the teachers have to be on the same page for a child to be reached. It's difficult to educate children. You should all be working together. And now, every time I go to the dentist's office, I get a questionnaire. Were you happy with the services provided? You get your car fixed. You get a survey. Are you happy with what happened there? This never happens in public education. It's an indicator. It's an indicator of its flaws, that there is no feedback loop. There's no way to correct the system. They put in top-down educational reforms, all right, that go on for decades. No one's taking any temperature on any evidence on whether the learning assistance program actually does assist learning or not. They just keep funding it. So it's broken. It's clearly broken, and parents can do so much better on their own. They just need a little direct support from the state. Why should they have to pay taxes, their property taxes and their sales taxes, to support the public schools, and then not get a quality service from the public schools and have to pay then double to educate their children? It's just too important of a topic.
In the free market, pricing is information. So people think of pricing as somebody just trying to snag profits, but there's more to it than that. Pricing tells you how much it costs to create the product and how much demand they think there is. And and it can change, really fast. So your pricing is going to change fast. So all this, the pricing of related products and all this, all that matters and is a part of that system of the invisible hand kind of moving people. With schools, the only kind of pricing information we have is this outrageous. If you take a child out, you're willing to pay the thousands of dollars extra in order to avoid getting that service for free, quote unquote, or the amount that you're obliged to pay, no matter if your kid goes to school or not. And so it's, they don't get much pricing information, but this pricing information is really big, really loud. They're still not getting it,
And yes, and it affects their budgets. All right. So so when 46,000 students do not show up, that's the size of the second largest school district in the state of Washington. That's a lot of students. That's hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue that these districts are not getting for those students. So you would think that they would be responding, but no, they've tapped into the COVID relief funding to fill in their budgets for these students they're no longer educating. It's all, it's all a misdirection of funding that was intended to help kids recover from COVID. Has been used to prop up district budgets. So it just shows you that this is not a system that delivers resources where they're most needed, just by definition. By definition, if you start to look at the who is hired in the public schools. You and I have talked about this before. Only about half of the employees in the public school system are actually teachers who are teaching and facing with children and trying to bring them along their path. That should tell you everything you need to know. If you compare that to a private school system, you have 80 to 90% of the employees in those systems. And in public charter school systems, same thing. You have most of the people working on the task of educating the children. In public education, that's not the case. You've got nearly 50% overhead support of some kind. Of course, they don't call it overhead. They call it assistance and all kinds of names for the extra extra hands that they use. They have assistants in the classroom. They have all kinds of other services that are not actually mission critical to the job of the schools. So that's because the money has really no accountability measure. We're spending $19,000 per student on average statewide. That is a lot of money and more than the cost of private school tuition. So what does that tell you?
Two quick questions from our audience. Janice asked, is there a school choice proposal in the works for Washington states?
Yes, there have been in the last few years several school choice proposals introduced in the legislative session that were blocked by the Democrats in control of the education committees because they were elected with the support of the union, and the union fights tooth and nail any kind of option for families to get out of the traditional public schools because they rely on the power and the money they get from keeping the system as is. So that's what's been going on. And I think there was one school choice proposal that actually got a hearing this year, but again, the chair of the House Education Committee blocked it, even though the polls show that 70% of the public, Democrats and Republicans alike, support giving parents a portion of their education money to pay for private school tuition. And what you could do is, since the schools are already getting $19,000 per student, you could give less than that to families, let's say $15,000 per student, and that would cover the cost of tuition at most private schools. So it's a win-win, right? If the public schools could keep that difference of $4,000 per student, not have to educate that child, could reduce the employees on staff that are no longer educating that child and save money, and keep some of the money, and it would also allow families to get a quality education for their children. And if that's the goal of public education, which of course it is, it's to educate the children, not to feed money to the system that is failing to educate children. Then as we see our way past this and clarify what our goals are and reset, I think what we're going through now is a reset after COVID. That's the best way I can think about it. Maybe it's a counter-revolution. I don't know how to describe it, but everyone's rethinking, what is this about? Public schools clearly have enough money. It's not the money. public schools have clearly, that all 40 years worth of top-down efforts to improve the schools have not worked. Why is that? Because we're dealing with a government monopoly that will rig the numbers, just as we see the lower standards here. That's what's happening. They're lowering standards right and left. So why not give a portion of it, like so many countries in Europe do? I mean, this is not a radical idea. This is, the money is provided by taxpayers to help parents, not to prop up government run schools. And you know, here in Europe, for example, Sweden has a voucher program to give parents this option if they're not happy with the local public school. Belgium, Holland, France, Norway, a lot of Western democracies respect the fact that the parents are the central pair in the education of children, and they know the children best. They're the child's first teachers. Their efforts should be supported. Why not help them find the best fit for that child? That's the ultimate decentralization of public education and supporting of the family and helping the child do better. And after what we did to the children during COVID, set them up for much harder lives in the next, really, Dave, I'm still upset. No one's talking about that. They are, you know, the children that were denied 2 years of education have now been set up for failure. They're not going to get into colleges as easily. When they get to school, when they get their jobs, they don't have the tools that they need to succeed. They're going to see lost revenue and earnings across their lives. We have hurt an entire generation of children because the COVID school shut down for 2 years. And what is the response of the system? Oh, there's nothing to see here. Oh, it's demographics that are reducing the number of children. Oh, we need to put CRT as, you know, racial, teach everyone to see one another through the lens of race. That's what we need to do. We need, in order to make everyone feel included. Oh, please, this is not what we should be doing. So anyway, get me going, Dave.
Next question is from Heidi. Isn't there a risk of unintended consequences by positioning this as giving parents their money to send their kids where the parent wants? We're talking about tax dollars, and the general public needs to support the goal of an educated population. The pendulum could swing the other way and cause taxpayers not to want to fund private education.
I think that taxpayers will support parents over systems. All right. I don't think that the dangers of the current system are far greater than placing some faith in parents. I think parents are the ones who know their kids the best. They know how to sort out the options in front of them. And I think taxpayers will find themselves very happy in supporting parents and helping their kids get educated. In fact, that all the studies are showing this in other states. Okay, the states of Arizona and Florida, Ohio, where they have had long-standing school choice programs, all show that, number one, the children get a better education, and number two, the systems, the existing traditional system responds to the competition posed by the prospect of losing money to a school choice program by improving what they provide to the children in the school, in the traditional school, so that they don't leave. Now, this is not a complex idea, and it's what our private market system is based on, but the public school system is protected from that. If the public school system needs anything, it's competition. They don't need more money. They don't need more top-down school programs, efforts to fix the schools. Those have all failed. What the public school system needs more than anything, this is what Milton Friedman said back in the 1950s, and it was his idea. To the brilliant economist, the Nobel Prize winning economist, a lot of us, our followers, know who he is. He said, what we need to do to improve the public schools is to create a school choice program where parents can leave if they're not satisfied. Now, that is accountability. That would create a feedback loop. That would make everyone in the public school system sit up and take notice and stop telling lies to the public about what's going on in the schools.
It's exciting to see how other states are finally embarking on the school choice challenge. And, if you create those kinds of marketplaces and new options pop up, you're inevitably going to have a lot of parents speaking to, hey, my child was really gifted in this area, couldn't be challenged here, but we got this and we did all these things, or my child had all these challenges and we couldn't get the services that really fit, I think once parents are exposed to that kind of freedom and that choice, it'll be harder to shut it down. It reminds me of the phone company. When I was growing up, I tell my kids, the phone used to just be on the table with the cord with no video screen. They're always horrified by it. And I remember when they were kind of breaking up Ma Bell, and there was this panic over what would happen. What are we going to do? There's going to be all this negativity, but we ended up with this array of choices and cell phones that do everything and all that. So it was exciting,
yes.
and we'll see that in education.
And we're seeing, it's the private schools that have the cutting edge therapies to help kids with, for example, with dyslexia. Okay, those expensive private schools are willing to look into what actually works, whereas the public school system is still stuck in an outdated model for identifying and helping children with dyslexia, who are 1 in 5 children. So what does that tell you? There's a school called Hamlin Robinson in Seattle. It's $40,000 a year. They know how to teach kids that have dyslexia and to succeed. And so that tells you the innovation is in the private school space, not in the public school space. So if you're trying to help children, especially kids with special needs, you would make sure that families with special needs have the resources they need to get the therapies that their children need. That would be the only right thing to do. So I'm very excited about giving parents this responsibility. Of course, it has to be done carefully. So taxpayers, as Heidi mentioned, we don't want to do it in a rash way. It has to be carefully followed so that the money isn't spent on something going to Hawaii or something. But these are all audited funds. They're carefully followed by the state to make sure that the money is used on education purposes only. In these other states, that's what they're doing, and they're not finding rampant fraud. They're not finding that these programs are not working. They're finding that the families are very happy with them. So, and the children are doing better. So what more?
Thanks, Liev. I think that's it's going to be an exciting aspect to watch for education. I appreciate your time today, and I know you've got some other things happening, so we'll let you go here.
Great,
and
thank you.
Let's say goodbye to Liev. Thanks, Liev.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Now let's go to Todd Myers. Todd, I feel like every year we talk about the forest fires in Washington State and what's wrong with state policy, and here we are again. With the appropriately named Diablo Fire, finally we have a fire worthy of its name. What do you think? First of all, is it the same policies before, the bad forest management policies that are having a greater impact or allowing fires to burn more than they should? And I know a lot of the fires we're seeing now are still in Canada, outside of our domain, so we'll stick with Washington State. But what are your thoughts so far about the fire season?
It's actually been a little bit quiet for a variety of reasons. It's hard to predict. If you remember back in the spring, there were a lot of articles that claimed that this was going to be a particularly bad fire season. It may yet. We often have late fires, and so later August and September, we may see fires. But so far, it's been fairly quiet, just without looking at the numbers, just sort of as looking at what's happening so far. But the issues that have primarily caused the fires have not gone away, which is forest health and a variety of other challenges related that make catastrophic fires more likely in our forests. We're making very slow progress on restoring those. And in fact, the environmental community continues to argue against those things, even as they admit forest health is a problem. And there's a supreme irony in the last month or so, which is that many in the environmental community are now arguing that we should stop timber harvesting on state lands because what they say is, well, the trees will grow and store CO2 and store carbon, and it's a good climate strategy. And there was a big article in the Seattle Times about this. But then, like days later, there was an article about a project in Southern Oregon where a private sector program had changed their forestry practices to allow the trees to store more carbon, and very similar to what the environmental community wants, and it was wiped out by fire. And so they had to go back and say, no, that the carbon credits that it had created for the California system, actually they had to rescind them because the trees were dead. They were no longer storing carbon. And the thing I think that's just most remarkable about this is that the environmental community very much is, in Washington State especially, is very opposed to those kind of forestry projects. That's what the whole story was about how, these sort of private sector programs where they get carbon credits in California, we actually basically have banned those in Washington State in our cap and trade system because the environmental community opposes them. Those same members of the environmental community say that we should manage state forests that way because they claim it will store CO2 emissions. And what you see with these, as is so often true, the exact same climate projects that they oppose in the private sector, they want taxpayer money to spend in the public sector. Somehow making it public magically makes them work, whereas in the private sector, they don't. And actually what we see is the exact opposite. The standards for projects in the private sector, the auditing, the other things that they have to meet are much higher than in the public sector. And so the private sector projects are the ones far more often that work compared to the public sector ones. So I think that, forest fires in general are interesting because of the debate about climate and forestry, but now the discussion of how we manage forests to deal with climate change and to store carbon shows that a lot of what is said about these management and how we and the relationship of forest management and climate change is simply based on ideology and not the science.
Isn't it just a case where, once again, the emphasis when it comes to environmental policy is not on results, but it's on kind of an ideological virtue signaling combined with a growth of bureaucracy, a bureaucratic power that basically employs the people that claim that this is the number one issue, even though their number one concern is not results for the number one existential issue. So
yeah, I think that there is just an assumption that if government does it, it must work and must be good, and that if private sector does it, it must be corrupt somehow. And that, I think, is the attitude. And Washington's climate policies reflect that. In Washington's climate policies, there is a section on carbon offsets, and it requires meeting all sorts of standards before you can count private sector climate projects that reduce CO2 emissions toward meeting the state's climate goals. But the state spends money on many of those exact same projects, and there are literally no standards for results or effectiveness. They don't actually go back and say, okay, what was the cost per metric ton? Did it achieve these goals and those sorts of things? So again, the private sector has far lower standards than the public sector. And, a great example of that is the fact that Governor Inslee sets these, targets for, how many electric vehicles, how many biofuels, all these sorts of things his administration is going to meet, and they consistently miss them. So it's I know that carbon offsets, what people call carbon offsets, are controversial among both the left and the right. On the left, they have skepticism because they don't like the private sector, and they think anything done by the private sector is necessarily suspect. On the right, they think carbon offsets are a manifestation of virtue signaling and sort of like indulgences. But I think actually, when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions most effectively and cost effectively, private sector innovation is the best thing we should be supporting, because they are the ways that we are going to find ways to reduce CO2 emissions at the lowest cost. If I created a technology that for $1 a metric ton could absorb a metric ton of CO2, right, our problem with climate change would be solved. Right? It would be very low cost. We could, reduce the amount of CO2. We could capture the CO2 that was emitted by fossil fuels. All that, we could do everything we wanted. And yet, on the left, they would literally, in Washington State, they would say you could only use that for a limited amount and actually would eventually ban that in Washington state. They would force people to switch to electric vehicles and get off natural gas heating and other things like that. They would force the lifestyle change that they want rather than letting technology do it. And that's just fundamentally irrational. And what it shows is that at the bottom is that what they want is to force lifestyle change and impose a government mindset rather than a private innovative approach. You are muted.
I said, I take it, all we can do to get beyond that is basically you can show people what the right path is. You can kind of remind them, and show the foolishness and the destructiveness of bad policy until you create kind of either a public climate where people are demanding, a policy that works, which is difficult because there's so much, I think, politicians, as you pointed out, Todd, get great headlines. Even the governor most recently on taking on the oil companies, for this gas hike costs, even though there's this mountain of evidence and a basic mathematical formula that show that the increase of gas comes from the cap and trade tax. He got a really solid headline and a big picture in the front page of the paper and TV coverage, taking on the oil companies, being tough. As long as there's that payoff there and the public isn't holding people to account for policies that don't actually work or are more expensive, the only way would be if there's almost an accidental change of power where, somebody gets into office who is actually concerned about those things, whether the public's demanding it or not, right?
That's exactly right. And you continue to get people repeating lies long after they have been debunked. And so last Friday in the Seattle Times, there was an editorial from Climate Solutions, which is a very far left-wing activist group on climate issues, who continued to claim that Washington, that oil companies—
Let me pause there, but never described, like every time Washington Policy Center's in the news, it's the right-leaning or the conservative think tank, and then Climate Solutions, which works on behalf of the climate.
Yes, exactly.
It's just no ideological bent whatsoever.
Well, and the irony is that if you look at their donors, it is lots and lots of companies who get subsidies from the government. So they go to Olympia and say, you should give subsidies to our donors. And somehow that is never questioned. But they continue to say things that are completely dishonest. So last Friday, they had this op-ed in the Seattle Times where they continue to claim that oil companies make more profit in Washington than virtually every other state. Well, that's false. There's no data that shows that. And the data point that they cited, we debunked a month and a half ago. The source that they cite says, no, that's not true. And yet here in the newspaper, they are still saying that exact same thing. So, people just continue to lie because there is no accountability for that dishonesty. And that's why our environmental policies continue to fail, is because the cost of failure is very low. The cost of lying is very low. But if you admit that you lied, or if you admit that you have to change, then people can say, aha, we caught you. So all the incentives are just to continue to be dishonest and to continue to fail.
And I should point out, it did not take you long to debunk that stat, because I remember when we first saw it, my first reaction was, wait a second, I have never heard anything close to this 85 cents, gallon thing. And then your first response was, I'm going to call the guy who wrote the statistic and find out what he meant by it, and it didn't take you long to find him. And the conversation didn't take too long to figure out that it was not true, what they were using it as.
I'll give you another example. 2 weeks ago, Governor Inslee held a press conference blaming the oil companies for the increase. And one of the things that he said at that press conference was that part of the increase in prices was due to a closed pipeline, the Olympic pipeline. And he actually even said, once that pipeline reopens, you will start to see prices come down. Well, the pipeline had been open for a month. It was closed for 3 days for maintenance, a month prior to the governor saying that. So here's the governor of the state of Washington standing in front of, the media, saying something that he has no idea what he's talking about and is categorically wrong. That's another thing that we said the month before, where I called both the people who manage the pipeline and some of their customers and said, is this true? What's going on? And one of their customers said, no, it's been open for a while. It was closed for 3 days. So here we knew it, but the governor, who has the entire state of Washington at his, at fingertips, can't even find out what's going on in his own state, or doesn't care to before he stands in front of the media and says something that turns out to be completely inaccurate.
I so wish Leslie Nielsen was still alive to play Governor Inslee in a biopic, because that press conference, if he would have just been asked to follow, once he said, hey, this, once this oil pipeline opens up, it's the prices are going down. If just anyone had said, yeah, that's been open for 3 weeks, Governor, that it just would have been a priceless comedic moment. And also, it's the kind of thing where that was actually published and talked about, I remember, by you already. So it's the kind of thing where, somebody should have actually followed up with that comment to say and challenged him on the spot. But I think that should have been an embarrassing moment, I think, for Washington media. And hopefully it'll be a teaching moment, but it requires some self-reflection first. So it's going to be tough. Back real quick to the forest fires, Todd, is there anything, if there was one policy change that you could make to assist Washington State with an alleviation of the forest fire damage and all that's happening, what might that be?
So the challenge with this is, if there was one thing you could do, is that it took us a long time to get to this spot where our forests are unhealthy, and so we need to do a lot of little things. There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. We could certainly, there is more money to be spent. The problem is that a lot of these forests are the amount of merchantable timber is less, the value is less than it costs to thin them. Now, in the future, once you thin them, the value will be more, but at this moment, you're going to have to spend money to hopefully make money in the future. So one, there's always limited resources. Another is that we just don't have enough mills. Part of the problem is that you can't take, the farther you have to take very low grade timber to a mill to process, to recover some of that value, the longer you have to take it, the worse the economics are. So we need more mills in Washington State, and that's something people recognize. Another thing is, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, in order to invest in a mill, you'd have to have some confidence that you could remain open,
Right.
not just be, banished to oblivion shortly thereafter.
And that's what, actually in Arizona, one of the things that they looked at with a study was about how they could improve the amount, the milling capacity and other things like that, to address the problem. And what the potential mill owners said is, look, we would need a 20-year guaranteed supply of timber. So how is the federal government, who can barely manage itself from year to year, going to say, we guarantee you 20 years of a sustainable flow of merchantable timber? And I just think that becomes very difficult in a lot of these places. That's where the unhealthy forests are, is in the federal lands. So it's not the private sector that has the problem, it's the public sector. And then the third thing I'll just mention is one that I really like, which is called Good Neighbor Authority. Good Neighbor Authority, we already have it in Washington State. And basically what it says is that the federal government can partner with state governments to harvest unhealthy forests, or in areas, do treatments where the federal government may have difficulty. And there's a variety of bureaucratic reasons why the state does a better job of putting up these timber harvests than the federal government, and does it more efficiently, does it more quickly, and those sorts of things. Washington's Good Neighbor Authority program is actually doing pretty well. The Department of Natural Resources is not as aggressive as they are in Idaho and other places, but still is doing a pretty good job. There is one area of expansion that I think we need to see, which is to allow tribes to do the same thing. Currently, tribes can do that. They can contract with the federal government to do these sorts of projects. The challenge is that when the state thins or harvests, the revenue that they get back goes into a fund. Technically, that fund belongs to the federal government, but the state can then use that fund to do the next harvest. So you have this sort of rolling income source of funding to continue and accelerate fixing our forests. The tribes right now under federal law are not allowed to do that same thing. They can't access that funds, and the funds have to go directly to the federal government. So if the tribes, and many tribes have federal unhealthy forests on their borders, they would like to go fix those. They say, look, let us do it. We have a timber program. We can go fix the forests that you guys can't. But because of this limitation, they haven't taken advantage of that in a way that is already working for the state government.
That is tragic, because, obviously that's, it's not just timber, it's habitat, it's, it's all the wildlife there. Much of that wildlife is the kind where we're spending all kinds of money, and, if that kind of damage was done through neglect by a private property owner, there'd be fury,
Yes.
and there'd be repercussions. But,
imagine your neighbor, spreading around gasoline and then lighting it on fire and it coming onto your property. You'd be pissed. But that's essentially what the federal forests are doing to tribal forests, right? You get the fires that start on the unhealthy federal forests and then get ripping and then move into tribal lands.
Yeah. Well, Todd, one quick question before we wrap it up from Heidi. Do you know what's going on with the petition to remove the carbon tax?
I don't know. I know that it is out there. I know that they are collecting signatures. So yeah, you'll have to. I haven't looked into that. They have a long way to go to get those signatures. So it's going to need a lot of work.
Now, would you call it the carbon tax, or would you call it the cap and trade tax?
Well, I call it a tax on CO2 emissions. The problem is that a carbon tax in climate economic circles means a specific thing. It means a flat price on CO2 emissions. That's not what we have. We have what is typically called cap and trade, but it's a hybrid without getting into the whole thing. So I just very simply call it a tax on CO2 emissions to make it easier.
Yeah. Well, Todd, as always, very informative. Thanks for making the time. And one of these days, we'll talk about good news when it comes to this, because, like you say, it might be the kind of thing where the tribes will lead the way on this, because they've got a lot of clout. They can continue to pressure on this and experiment. And, look, if they, creating healthy forests should be the kind of thing that you can get a lot of public opinion behind very quickly. So look forward to that day.
Yep.
Todd, thanks.
You
bet. All right. Some folks were asking, where do we go to get a recording? To go to the Washington Policy Center YouTube channel. We have the Washington Policy on the Go are posted there, usually within 24 hours or so of the broadcast. We will see you all in 2 weeks with more Washington Policy on the Go.